this thing called economic freedom. I've got this thing in my mind called economic freedom. I think I know what it is in some vague sense. I've got a lot of variables that I can collect that I think contribute to that thing called economic freedom. But I don't know. I don't have a lot of strong prior views as to what the correct weighting system is. In the absence of that, we just average. And that opens up, and I invite people to do other schemes. And there have been papers and other people have done work to try to reweight the index in different ways to see if it matters and so forth.
Can I just ask something? But if you were using principal component analysis, you're obviously looking principal contribution towards some correlation or some factor. So what is the factor that you're trying to correlate these factors to? Is it economic growth? Is it some measure of wealth? What is it?
Well, that's just it. No, the short answer to that is economic freedom, which is some latent variable in my mind. I don't. That's exactly the point. I don't know exactly what that thing is. If I knew it, if it was growth, for example, then I could easily do some weighting scheme for that. But I'm not doing an economic growth index. I'm doing an economic freedom index. Economic freedom is an unmeasured, latent type variable, and we don't have there's no obviously right, philosophically correct weighting system. So we use averages. I have a sort of Bayesian defense for it in statistical terms, but that's a more complicated
So then you have to make a leap of faith that economic freedom has some effect on the quality of life or whatever if you want to have dialogue with policymakers.
I don't have to make a leap of faith. At the end of the day, I've got these indicators. Each of these indicators, I think, is a part of what I think economic freedom is, and I've aggregated them up in a particular way, which is subject to some criticism because there are other ways to aggregate them. And I invite people to do other ways. I don't have a problem with that. My suspicion after doing a lot of work with this is that, for the most part, the final number is pretty robust to reasonable alternate weighting systems. So it doesn't matter a lot is the short answer. Yeah.
Is there did you take into account any kind of consumer price index or anything that they would be spending the money on, maybe nominal GDP, how much money they can spend? And I know that since it's a government analysis more than anything, perhaps this doesn't come into play. But
well, we do have a measure of inflation, and we use a CPI for that here. But there's no direct measure of economic well-being here. In other words, there's no measure of GDP per capita or anything of that sort.
Does that come later?
Or well-being. That's going to come when we do correlations later. Yes.
Follow on Rabbi Glickman's question. The premise in the effectiveness of this metric is that economic freedom is a good. And that's where the analogy, the cartoon analogy with the screaming match breaks down to the chemistry, because this is helpful for an insider dialogue with a community that already takes as a premise that economic freedom is the good that we are looking to advance, and so that we can measure within that community of discourse, we can measure which countries do a better job of realizing that value. But as a tool to engage in dialogue with policymakers or thinkers, philosophers that don't share that fundamental premise that economic freedom is itself a good, then this is a very, I think, useful metric within a camp, but it doesn't seem to do the work across worlds of this.
That's an excellent question, although I think I disagree.
Okay.
I don't think that the premise of this exercise is that economic freedom is good. My premise of this exercise is that economic freedom is a thing. It is something. Freedom is something.
But that's total. I mean, that's maybe not.
Well, in the same sense that GDP is something. Gross domestic product, as we teach our students, is the total value of all the goods and services produced. It's a thing. Is more GDP a good thing? Now that's a separate question entirely. The measurement of GDP, though, is separate from the question of whether or not GDP is a good thing. And I think the same could be said here. Freedom is a thing. People are either more free or not free to spend it. And then the second question is more of it good or bad, and on what margins is more of it good or bad? And that's what I think.
That second realm of question.
That's why we need this index, though. Until you have a measurement of freedom, you can't then start to ask those questions about, is it good in some, at least in a consequentialist sense, does it lead to certain consequences that we consider to be good? Again, ultimately what's good and bad is a normative that is in everyone's subjective hearts and minds. But I'm looking at this as sort of a sterile, almost scientific exercise of measurement of this thing, and then I'm leaving to the second half of the talk really some speculation on whether or not it's good. But I really do, the co-authors and I, we really do try to keep blinders on as to that, and we try not to actually inadvertently throw in anything into the index that would subvert that goal. Like we don't want to put GDP per capita in there because that's that's a result.
Like a very effective metric for measuring freedom, but then the question is, how are you going to measure the virtue or the corresponding value or quality that might be in competition, so to speak, with freedom, that then you have to actually make a decision based on the weight, so to speak, of these two different types of qualities or two different types of considerations. Okay. So,
well, I'm not sure I totally understand the question. I mean, we're basically creating a measurement of one thing on a number line, and so it only has that one dimension.
I'm saying it's very useful in arguing or sharing with friends who have a similar sense of ranking of value, that freedom is in fact something that is a good. It's not just a thing, but it's a thing that we value, and it's a thing that if we want to make judgments about how societies should structure themselves.
Well, yeah, I'm not so sure. I mean, I'm not so sure. Again, because what if someone came to me and says, I just want to live in a rich place? And then the question is, well, this is Smith's point. What does it take to be a rich place? What are the nature and causes of the wealth of nations? Well, I might say, I think freedom might have something to do with it. And so, even if you don't care about freedom as a good and value in and of itself, if you care about something else, and freedom is an instrument for that, then that's what this is all about to me. There are people that care about freedom as a value in and of itself, and I confess to probably being one of them. But I don't think that's necessary for the exercise. And in fact, I actually do think that for those people who really don't place freedom in and of itself as a high value, that having this, then we can at least talk, is it an instrumental value to the values that you do care about? If you tell me that you care about income inequality, then I'm curious, does this thing that I care about, does it work for or against what you care about? And that's what we're trying to get at, ultimately. Shoot, I was going to ask who's number one. I just clicked though. It's Hong Kong. Okay, no. Probably no. I mean, if you really study the world at all, it's not a great surprise. Hong Kong is without question the highest rated country in the index. We actually have data going all the way back to 1970. They've been the highest rated country, and every year we have numbers. It has very low government taxation and spending. It has a very secure property rights regime. I don't remember off the top of my head how many days it takes to settle a dispute in Hong Kong courts, but I'm pretty sure it's pretty swift and fair. No monetary problems, free trade, literally free trade. I mean, no tariffs, no quotas whatsoever. I mean, it is. They've done exactly what Smith wanted them to do.
Why aren't they at 10 then?
Well, it's not a perfect place. They do have some taxes. They do have their property rights ratings are not perfect 10s. They're not perfect. Nobody's really perfect. If you wanted some anecdote, they do have a minimum wage now. They just passed, for example, first one. But it's really, really free. It's so free that it almost should stand all by itself off in a category. With the index process, by putting everything on 0 to 10s, it kind of compresses everybody. Hong Kong really is far out in the front of everybody else. Singapore is number 2, and this invites me an opportunity to mention something that's very important. Singapore is a great place. I'm no problem with this rating for Singapore as far as economics is concerned. If you want to open up a business, you can do so in Singapore with very few interferences and very low taxes. And Singapore courts are very, very very secure. If you own a piece of property in Singapore, it's as secure there as it is anywhere else on the planet Earth. But we are very narrow in our use of the term economic here. We're not addressing social freedoms and civil liberties and political freedoms, freedom of press, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and so forth. Needless to say, Singapore is not a high point for civil liberties and so forth. Singapore really does stand out as an oddball country that has a lot of economic freedom, but not a lot of civil liberties. And most of the other countries on this list, you'll see, have both a relatively high amount of economic freedom, but also a relatively high amount of civil liberties. But Singapore stands out as an oddball. One of the questions I'm interested in, I don't have a real firm answer on, is how do they pull it off? Is it sustainable? Is it something that they can do for a long time? This is it's an interesting case, but just bear in mind that there's nothing in our index about freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of press. Not because we don't care about those things, but because there are other indexes that do a very good job of measuring those things, and we felt no need to trample on their ground. Other groups do that. Amnesty International, Freedom House here in New York is a venerable organization that's been doing civil liberties and political rights indexes for 40 years or something, and they're a great group. We don't want to. They do a good job. We don't need to reinvent their wheel. Okay. We're just interested in: can you keep the money you earn? Can you trade with whoever you want? Can you buy and sell with people freely? And is your property secure? We're interested in those sort of narrowly defined economic areas, and the broadly civil, which are very important, but those areas we're keeping off to the side. Let's see, anything else? Chile has gotten up to the top 10. They've kind of come up. The United States is now 6th. These numbers are for 2007, by the way. This is from the 2009 report. The 2010 report is about to come out in about 3 weeks. The U.S. is still going to be 6th. But the data are always about 2 years behind. It's like a physicist. I think it takes 2 light years for the data to get to me. By the time it percolates from the countries, gets reported to the World Bank, gets put in the World Bank database, and I can download it, it takes about 2 years. So we're always about 2 years behind on the numbers. So I have the 2008 numbers, but I'm not allowed to talk about them yet. So we publish. Let me go back to the gentleman in the back.
I was just surprised by Swiss placement because they have a draft, from what I understand. Yeah. So how much did you weigh that? I mean, they did.
Well, we do have conscription is a variable, but it's one variable in that 5th area. The 5th area has about 14 variables. So when you're just doing a simple average, it's 1/14 times 1/5. It's a very small weight. And also, the length of time matters. And if my recollection serves, that the active duty time isn't that long, so they don't get a 0. They get like a 5 or something like that. There are some countries that require you to do like 36 months, like 3 full years of active duty, and they get 0s. So there's a scaling on that depending on the length of the mandatory service. Yes?
Just based on what you said about Singapore, if you took one of the like Amnesty International's metric and ran like a correlation with your metric, did you find that freedom as well?
In fact, there's a few papers that have been written on the 2 freedoms, sometimes, and the answer is absolutely is a positive correlation. Singapore notwithstanding, there is a strong positive relationship. Simple correlation coefficient between like the Freedom House ratings and our rating is about 0.6, positive 0.6. That's statistically significant. It's strong, but it's not 1. I mean, there are plenty of Singapores. And then there are on the other side, there are some that have low economic freedom that have fairly good civil liberties. There's some one of the ones that sort of in my mind is like Bahamas. It's fairly low ratings in my index, but there's you can speak and write and do anything you want in Bahamas. There's no civil liberty issues there. So there are outliers, but if you were regressing them between each other, you'd see a pretty good relationship. I'm actually doing some research on my own on this as well, but about that very question. Yeah.
Forgive me for asking the obvious, perhaps it's because I'm Canadian, but why is Canada have a seemingly higher number but rated less than Ireland?
That's obviously a mistake. And I've probably used this slide 20 times, and I've never observed that. That's obviously that's obviously just a flat-out mistake. Of course, the two are.
He must not like